And now I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Keith Moore. Now, I may consume quite a bit of your time if I want to tell you all about Dr. Keith Moore. However, briefly, Dr. Moore is the Dean of the College of Medicine at the University of Toronto in Canada. He is a professor of embryology, has been professor for 20 years in the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, and he has been the chairman of the department for 11 years. Dr. Moore has written about 7 books actually, 4 books in embryology, 1 in neuroanatomy, and 2 in gross anatomy. Dr. Moore is a fellow of International Academy of Psychology. He is the president of the American Association of Clinical Anatomists, and his books are being taught in the medical schools throughout the world, not only in this country or Canada, but throughout the world. And his research in the embryology field is very outstanding. I believe that you will find it so when we listen to Dr. Moore. May we welcome Dr. Moore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be here. When I was first called about attending this meeting, I didn't think it was going to be possible for me to do so, but I didn't realize at the time that it was the Students' Association that was inviting me here. Had I known that, I probably would have accepted right away, because I get a lot of invitations from students groups across Canada, United States, and I try to accept as many of those invitations as I can. So I want to tell you about some studies that I and others have done in the last 10 years. I first became aware of the Quran about 10 years ago when I visited Saudi Arabia at the invitation of King Abdulaziz University to lecture in embryology. And at that time I was asked about some of the meaning of some of the verses in the Quran, and I tried to interpret them as best I could, and that really started a study which has lasted for about 10 years in a part-time way, and I've been happy to tell people about these findings, because it's been very inspiring to me, because I've always been interested in the history of embryology, and some of the early history is not very well known to us. Now I'm going to follow my notes fairly closely so that I won't talk too long. So I want to start then with the historical background, and the first scientific studies in embryology, as far as we know, were done by the Greek scientists in the 5th century BC. Hippocrates, who we know as the father of medicine, and after whom the Hippocratic Oath is named, was one of the first to write books on embryology. And later Aristotle, another famous Greek philosopher and scientist, studied chick embryos, actually opened eggs and was able to study the development. Concluded at that time, and this is 4th and 5th century BC, that man's development, that is human development, was similar to that of the chicken. The writings of Aristotle and Galen, another scientist, dominate the early part of our historical record, and from the time of Galen, around 200 AD, until the 16th century, no major advances in our knowledge of embryology were recorded in the literature of Western science. This is mainly because these kind of studies were forbidden in those very dark ages. Consequently, as far as we know, until the revelations in the Quran, man was relatively ignorant about his reproduction and development. It was not until the invention of the microscope in the 17th century that any significantly new information was added to the field of embryology. Before this time, the fetus was said to develop from a coagulum of human blood and the seed. There's really no idea of how we developed, but in the days of Aristotle, they believed, as Sheikh Mustafa Ahmed said, that menstrual blood was the thought to give rise to the embryo, and that they really didn't know anything about spermatozoa or sperms. But when the microscope was discovered, if we could have that first slide. Now, these early microscopes were very primitive by our standards today. This first slide, I don't know whether they're going to, can you see those? Well, that's a picture of Aristotle there, one of the earliest writers in human embryology. Maybe with the microscope could come on. Yeah, this is a microscope that was invented by Leeuwenhoek in 1694. And this is a very crude microscope. As you can see, the object, whatever it was you were looking at, was put on the end of a needle point, and there was a small magnifying glass, and you would look at this, but it didn't give very much magnification. It'd be equivalent to what you would get now if you used a magnifying glass. So it wouldn't give very much enlargement. So this is the state of knowledge in the 17th century, and it would not be possible for them to see the early stages of human development even at that time. Now, when they did see what they thought was a sperm, they thought that this sperm, and if we could just have, they visualized this sperm with a little imagination, that inside that sperm or male germ cell was a little human being. And all it needed was for it to be implanted in the female, and in the environment of the mother's uterus, this would stimulate this little person to start developing. And so the real role of the female then was to give this little embryo a place to develop and to stimulate it. Now, I should say, in fairness, there were others who believed that the female ovary, the oocytes or eggs, they contained the little human being. So there was two groups. One said the little human being was in a sperm. Others said it was in the oocyte or egg, and that when they started to develop, then this little person just got bigger. So that shows you what our knowledge was like in the 17th century. The fact that the sperm and the ovum were necessary for conception was not known until the 18th century, when there were further refinements in our optical instruments, microscopes were better developed and so on, and so they were actually able to see the sperm and the egg and realize then that they actually came together in a process which was called fertilization. Now, later in the development of embryology, they developed the idea of stages. And the first attempts to arrange human embryos in stages were made towards the end of the 19th century. And these efforts continued during the early part of the 20th century. In 1914, Dr. Moll in this country arranged 266 human embryos in a series of stages. 28 years later, Dr. Streeter, also of the United States, classified human embryos in 23 stages, which he called developmental horizons. Now, Streeter's classifications were used worldwide until 1973, when Dr. Ronan O'Reilly, who's at University of San Diego, developed a more detailed system for classifying human embryos, particularly during the first 3 weeks of development. Now, these Carnegie stages, that is named after the Carnegie Institute of Embryology, have received international approval and are based on various developmental events and morphological criteria. And these timetables of human development are from my book, which I developed in about 1970, based on the Carnegie stages of human development. And at this time, when I did these stages, I had no awareness that there was anything about human development in the Quran. So it's only then in the last 15 to 20 years that we've had a good knowledge of the stages of human development. Now, this knowledge has increased rapidly in the last few years. Now, a major difficulty in the classification of terminology is the fact that the shape of the embryo is continuously changing. The principles for nomenclature and for terminology for descriptive embryology are the terms that are applied to a particular development which would be descriptive of what the embryo really looks like. There should also be full agreement between the term and the nature of the development and events occurring at that stage. In order to avoid confusion, each term should define a stage which has a clear beginning and an end, as is possible, in order to avoid any overlap between stages, or on the other hand, to avoid any gaps between one stage and another. Now, it was about this time that I began to study the Quran and to look at verses referring to embryology. So I found that there was a large terminology in the Quran referring to human development. Now, until recently, it was not known that this holy book of the Muslims and the Sunnah, or Hadith, the teachings of Muhammad, contain many citations referring to the stages of human development. Until recently, these statements were not clearly understood, since they referred to details in development which were scientifically unknown in earlier times. In fact, the Islamic system for classifying human embryos is amazing, since it was recorded in the 7th century A.D. Although Aristotle, as I mentioned before, the founder of the science of embryology, realized that chick embryos developed in stages from hen's eggs in the 4th century, he did not give any details about these stages. Also, the early human embryo is of such a minute size that detailed studies would have been impossible without the microscope. In the very early stages of human development, the first few days, it's so small that you could just barely see it. In other words, it's about the size of a period at the end of a sentence. And you could realize how, without our modern microscopes, you would not be able to see any of those details of the early stages. Now, as far as we know from the history of embryology, little was known about the staging and classification of human embryos until the last 100 years, as I've just mentioned. Moreover, the Quranic terminology fulfills the principles for nomenclature and terminology. For this reason, the descriptions of human embryos in the Quran cannot be based on scientific knowledge in the 7th century. The only reasonable conclusion is that these descriptions were revealed to Muhammad, peace be upon him, by God. He could not have known such details because he was an illiterate man. He was not a scientist or an embryology, and he did not have scientific training. Now, in the following passages from the Quran, we introduce the concept of stages in human development. And this first verse was the first one that was shown to me. And you can read that there. God created man from a quintessence of clay. He then placed him as a nutfa, a droplet, in a place of settlement, firmly fixed. Then we make the nutfa into an alaka, a leech-like structure, and then he changed the alaka into a mudga, a chewed-like substance. Then we made out of that mudga isam, I can't read too well here, skeleton, and then we clothed the bones with muscles. Then we caused him to grow, and then we came into bone, into being and attain the definitive human form. So blessed be God, the best to create. This is from one of the surahs. So, we have the next one, I believe, that shows this is the Islamic. Now, this are the stages that we found in the Quran, and it's taken a lot of study and discussion to arrive at the meaning of these stages. The first one is the nutfa, or the drop stage, and then the second is the klaq, or shaping stage, and then the nasha, or the growth stage. Now, the proposed system is clear, it's comprehensive, and conforms with present embryological knowledge. And it's our hope that this terminology can be introduced internationally. But if nothing more, at least the Muslim science students can realize that the stages that we talk about in our embryology textbooks are the same. It's just that they have different names. Now, the principles for the terminology then, that they be descriptive of appearance, and that they reflect the processes occurring, and that they be avoid ambiguous beginning and an end. In other words, they should be clear as to what these stages refer to. And this was actually the first verse that was ever read to me when I was in Saudi Arabia, and I'd never. I knew that the Quran existed, but I'd never read it before. And when they asked me what this verse meant to me, I said, well, it was obvious. It makes you in the wombs of your mother, which is the uterus, of course. Womb is simply English translation of the Latin uterus, in your mother's in stages. So here is talking about stages, which is similar to what Hippocrates and Aristotle had talked about, one after another in 3 veils of darkness. Then I was asked what this 3 veils of darkness might be, and it occurred to me that it might be, as I've indicated here in these slides, that the first veil of darkness around this developing human would probably be the anterior abdominal wall, that is the skin, muscles, and so on around the mother, forming the wall, anterior wall of the mother's abdomen. 2, I thought, would be the wall of the uterus, the organ which contains the embryo, and then inside that uterus we have other membranes which we call the amnion and the chorion, and we combine that because they fuse together. We call it the amniochorionic membrane. Now, this was my initial interpretation of this, and I've heard many different other interpretations of what these veils of darkness are. And I don't suppose we will ever know exactly what that verse meant, but this interpretation has been accepted by some of the prominent embryologists around the world. And I have invited my friends, as mentioned, Dr. Johnson from Jefferson Medical College, Dr. Prasad from Winnipeg, Dr. Edwards from Cambridge, who some of you remember Steptoe and Edwards. Dr. Edwards were the first ones to produce a baby in vitro, and little Louise Brown was the first one. And Dr. Edwards agreed with our interpretations of this. So, and then we went on and studied other verses. Now this shows the description of the mother and the relationship, the mother to the conceptus. Conceptus is simply the developing embryo plus the membranes that are around it. And that is the nutfa, is the conceptus, and these other stages referring to the uterus, and so on. These are all terms that are in the Quran. And we then placed him as a nutfa, or a drop, in a place of settlement firmly fixed. When I was asked what this would mean, I obviously thought of the settlement or implantation of the early human embryo, which we call a blastocyst, into the lining of the uterus. The Nutfa stage involves the sperm and the ovum and their union to form the fertilized zygote, the cell division to form the blastocyst, and the implantation into the uterus. Now the shaping stage is further divided into alaka, as I mentioned, mudga, islam, and lam stages. During the latter part of this stage, the embryo also develops a human appearance and undergoes a straightening of its bodily form. The growth stage includes what is now known as the fetal period of human development, involves modification in the bodily proportions, the development of the individual appearances or features, and the growth and refinement of the various organ stages. Now we'll look at the Nutfa stage, which is the initial stage, which is what in ordinary embryology we would call the zygote. The word Nutfa means a small amount of fluid or a drop of it. As the first stage is called the Nutfa, it includes 5 phases or substages which involve the mixing of male and female germinal fluids, fertilization, implantation, and early cell division. And so we'll deal then with the phases of the Nutfa. And the first is the mani. It's been discovered that the first stage is formed from a part of the male fluid, that is the Nutfa of the father, which includes the sperm, and part of the female fluid, which is the Nutfa of the mother, which includes the ovum. Now the Arabic term mani is used mainly to describe the sperm, although it is also used to describe both the sperm and the ovum. During the fertilization process, the male fluid travels from the vagina up through the uterus and meets the female fluid in the uterine tube or oviduct, or as some people call it, the fallopian tube. According to the Islamic statements, fertilization does not occur from all of the fluids, from the male and the female, but from a minute portion of them. As the Quran states, was he not a drop of germinal fluid, mani, emitted? And mani here refers to the sperm and the ovum. Other components of the male and female fluids aid in the fertilization process. The semen, that is the mixture of sperms and fluids, contain hormones called prostaglandins, which induce the uterine contractions, and they may aid in the transport of the sperm to the fertilization site. Important components of the female fluid also contribute to this process. During the female fertile phase of the woman's menstrual cycle, the cervical mucus, which is otherwise fairly impervious to sperm, becomes clear and gel-like through a realignment of its molecules and allows the sperms to pass. Enzymes secreted by the linings of the uterus and the oviducts capacitate, that is, they remove a covering from the sperm, which are called glycoproteins, and this enables it to then participate in fertilization. Sperms are unable to fertilize ova unless they've been capacitated. Additionally, enzymes are secreted by the oviducts, which loosen the follicular cells surrounding the ovum and expose its protective membrane to the sperm. The fact that the fluids of the male and the female are involved with fertilization was mentioned in the following hadith. When the Prophet, peace be upon him, was asked by a Jewish person, "O Muhammad, what is man created from?" the Prophet answered, "O Jew, he is created from both, from the fluid of the man and the fluid of the woman." Thus, the word nutfa used in the hadith is a very comprehensive term. Now, the next term is called sulala. This refers to the selection from the male and the female fluids, as the following passage mentions. Not from all fluid is the offspring created. And when I was asked about this, I explained that when we develop, we only develop from a small portion. Thus, the creation from both fluids occurs through a special selection. The Quranic term for this selection is sulala, which means in Arabic gentle extraction from fluid. It is now known that both the ovum and the sperm are gently extracted from their environments in the process of fertilization. The ovum is selected from a long stream of follicular fluid, while one sperm out of millions is selected from the seminal fluid. The first sperm which touches the cell membrane of the ovum enters easily, but immediately afterwards a rapid change occurs in the cell membrane, selecting that sperm only, and all other sperms are locked out. Now, talk again about the nutfa or nutfa amshad. The fertilized ovum, or zygote as we call it, takes the form of a drop, or a nutfa amshad, which is a drop of mingled fluid. As God says in the Quran, we created man from a drop of mingled fluid, that is the nutfa amshad. An important point with regard to this phrase is the fact that nutfa is a singular noun, while amshad is a plural modifying adjective. According to the conventional rules of grammar, singular nouns are normally modified by singular adjectives, and thus the term nutfa amshad was a mystery to early Quranic scholars. However, this peculiarity in the language can now be explained, since we now know that the zygote remains singular as a nutfa, while internally the chromosomes and other contributions from the sperm and ovum form a plural mixture described as amshad. Therefore, from a scientific point of view, amshad is entirely accurate as a plural adjective modifying the singular nutfa, which is really a multifaceted entity, single entity. This stage continues in development, maintaining the shape of the nutfa, but dividing it into smaller and smaller cells called blastomeres. Until about 4 days later, it forms a spherical mass of cells known as a morula. 5 days after fertilization, the nutfa then forms a blastocyst as the morula cells separate into two parts. During this time, the term amshad very appropriately applies to the nutfa in all of its developments, since it continues to be a multifaceted entity. The next stage is called takdir. In the early formation of the nutfa amshad, the chromosomes form from both parents, and they mix, and that is what gives rise to the human embryo. This genetic mixture will determine the characteristics of the child as well as the child's sex. As the Quran mentions, He created him from nutfa and immediately laid down the plan or the program of his future development. He created him then agrees completely with our understanding. We know that the chromosomes in the mother and the father unite at fertilization, and that we are then a mixture of the chromosomes of our mothers and fathers. And that this is all determined at this very early stage of nutfa. And we didn't understand that until probably about in the 1920s. Now, the last stage of this early development is called hearth. In the last phase of the nutfa amshad, the blastocyst implants into the endometrium, or the lining of the uterus. This passage from the Quran states, "Your wives are a tilth or a hearth unto you, so approach your tilth when or how you will." Tilth or hearth refers to cultivation of the soil. So it's clear that an understanding of the lining of the uterus, or what we call the endometrium, was very much like soil, that when the blastocyst implants, it gets its nourishment from the mother's blood, just as a plant, roots of a plant, get its nourishment from the soil. The last step of the nutfa stage begins with implantation of the blastocyst and is called the hearth phase. The Quran considers this process analogous to the cultivation of the soil and the lining of the uterus like soil in which the seed develops. Indeed, the blastocyst embeds and roots itself into the endometrium with cells which will eventually form the placenta, just as the seed embeds itself in the soil. This shows the uterus at the top, and the red area, which is blown up in the bottom, is the lining of the endometrium of the uterus, into which the blastocyst, or early human embryo, implants, and it gets its nourishment from those blood vessels and mother's blood, which carries the oxygen and nutrient substances to it. And the comparison then to a seed developing in the soil is a very accurate one. So that the development and the structural changes which occur during the nutva stage are virtually impossible to detect without a microscope due to the minute size of the nutva. And if we look at the next pictures there, I guess that's the end of that portion. So this is the first part of my presentation, and we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions. Thank you very much.